Thanks to everybody for watching and listening. I'm here today with Gabrielle Bates, whose poetry has appeared in the New Yorker, Poetry, American Poetry Review, and other publications. A writer, visual artist, and co-host of the Poet Salon podcast, Bates is originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and now lives in Seattle, Washington. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. I love how you think and talk about books, so it's a real honor to get to be here.
So I've spent the last month or so like really diving into this collection, which I can't say I've done for a lot of poetry collections. I kind of find poems I like. I'm also like really into spoken word poetry, so sometimes I'm more enjoy like listening to it. I know we'll have you read a couple poems today, but yeah, this has been an awesome experience. It's also like it's even like I've become like closer with some of my poet friends who I've been like, can we like talk about these, sit down for coffee, whatever, whatever. So that's been fun.
I
I
love
first,
that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
love that. Poetry bringing people together.
yeah. The first poem in this collection, which I heard you read in LA, is The Dog. And it's super unique for a couple of reasons. One being like super straightforward language, which was I think was cool to hear out loud because it wasn't like super poetic up until the very last line. And then that last line like carries into the book, kind of like everything becomes more poetic language after that, which I thought was really interesting. So I'm wondering why you chose to put that poem first. You kind of separated it from the collection. And it's like, I mean, it's obviously what drew me in, but also, yeah, it kind of feels off like with the rest of the collection. So I'm wondering why, like, that's what people are going to open to. That's the first thing they're going to look at. Why is that first? And yeah, what does that poem mean to you?
Yeah, so The Dog is a poem that it's so intense and it's so narrative. And as you said, the language is really sort of stripped down. It doesn't have all the kind of bells and whistles and flourishes that one might typically associate with a poem. And at first, I really resisted putting it first because I worried it would turn readers away. I worried that the trauma and intensity at the heart of it might be repellent to some readers. I worried that stylistically it might set readers up for a certain expectation I would then subvert, which risks disappointing certain readers. If they go in expecting everything to be more in that plain spoken mode, then the more lyrical strangenesses that come later, readers have to be willing to trust you and or at least be seduced by you forward. So I really resisted putting it first, but the poem wouldn't go anywhere else. I tried it every other place in the book and it demanded to go at the beginning. And I think in some ways it is because it's a bit of an outlier. I think in some ways it feels emotionally or in tone like the most severe and cutting that the narrator or narrators throughout the book ever gets. And so in some ways it made sense as a starting place because I was thinking about the arc of the book as a whole and wanting to end on more of a tenderness. And so to start at a place of kind of utmost sharpness and severity and then sort of gradually with some meandering make our way to a more tender portrayal or approach to love, attachment, dependency, all these sorts of themes that rear their heads in The Dog, that opening poem. And then I personally often need a little bit of like a breath or a break after I read that poem. And so that's one of the reasons I decided to set it off as kind of a preface and give a section break after that opening poem, so that the reader could sort of sit with it, have that beat of breath, of silence, to feel the echoes and reverberations of that poem, and then continue on, kind of traveling through that poem as a little gate into the rest of the world of Judas Goat.
Yeah, that's completely how I felt. I completely see what you mean, like not fitting anywhere else. Like it has to be first, which is interesting. I want to talk, and I know you said you need a break after reading that
Not
poem.
much of one,
So
and I've read
yeah,
it so
okay.
many times
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, I wonder if you could talk about the ending of that poem, what it says about how we relate to each other romantically or platonically, and like the responsibility we feel for how others treat us.
It's for me, it's very much about that thorny complexity of what we want to know, but we're afraid to know, the role of secrets in any relationship and the inevitable reverberation of violence, of harm. And there's sort of the inciting traumatic incident that is, traumatic in a certain radius. And then the witnesses to that event are also impacted. And then the people that they tell about that instigating event become impacted themselves. Like the way that an act of violence moves through relationally a population of people is something that's very interesting to me, that feels worthy of my attention. And I think that's one of the major things I was looking at in that particular poem, is sort of trying to evoke or illustrate that ripple effect and the need to pass it on in some way, and the desire of a romantic partner, a friend, anyone, to know what the beloved is going through, has gone through, and the shock or kind of betrayal of realizing that they might not be privy to everything, that they might be living in intimacy with someone and not know something really traumatic has happened to them, that they've witnessed. Well, there's that decision to divulge, right? I think
Hmm.
that's a major hinge, an interest point for me in that poem and across the book in various ways, is deciding what you're going to tell and when and how, and the site of intimacy that that creates, the
Hmm.
vulnerability of that act of speaking, of divulging the difficult story, the difficult truth, the confession. And this book was so obsessed with sort of the risks of intimacy, of making yourself vulnerable to another person, whether that's, romantically or otherwise. And so this story felt like it was giving me a way to illustrate and make felt the drama and the stakes of, many things, including that decision to divulge, to speak, to break a silence, to harm someone else in a way, while also inviting them into deeper intimacy with you. And the way that you often don't get to choose, one of the, you don't just get the good stuff, without the bad sometimes. I don't know if
That's
that
super.
makes
Yeah,
sense,
no,
but
no, no. Like burdening somebody else by telling them your burdens, and especially catching like this. I guess the speaker's like there was no sense in me that he was in some sort of aftermath, so not expecting it, but it. Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting.
and the haunting realization of that, to not have that intuition, to not know that this person you live with, this person you love, has just
Hmm.
gone through something, kind of cataclysmic, and what that makes you question then about yourself and your attention to the world and the people around you. Um, yeah, so many hauntings in this book, so many hauntings in that poem.
That's yeah. That's wow. Okay, so would you mind reading that poem?
Yeah,
I do have yeah one more small question after, but I'll try not to spend the whole interview on the dog.
that's
Um,
okay. That's okay. It's a
yeah,
first poem for a reason,
yeah, 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 yeah.
Another reason I'll just say that I wanted to put it first, because you mentioned sort of the more plain spoken approach. I think a lot about how ordering a book length collection has lot of similarities with thinking about the order of information in an individual poem. And I often prefer, if I can, to begin a poem in a very rooted, kind of clear image or
Mm,
situation, because I feel like that is extending a hand to the reader, giving them some stable ground to stand on. And then I can get wilder and weirder and more abstract, perhaps, from there. And so, in thinking about the order of a collection, it made sense to me to begin with a type of language, with a type of scene that I could imagine the vast majority of readers being able to come along with me, um, as like giving some stable ground to enter the book. Um, so this is the US edition of Judas Goat. This is what it looks like, but I thought it might be fun. This will be like a world premiere because I haven't shown this anywhere. This is going to be the
Wow.
UK edition of the book. I just got this proof to proofread. So I thought I'd read from that because I've never
Wow.
done that before.
Well, congrats on the UK edition. That's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's coming out this fall, late October from the 87 Press. So shout out to them for taking the poems across the pond. Um, the dog. He didn't want to tell me. He almost didn't. It was luck, much more than gut, that made me ask. A beer opened an hour earlier than usual. The desire for conversation. There was no sense in me that he was in some sort of aftermath. He said, when I asked, I had a bad day, or I had a weird day. I can't remember. I saw a dog, he said. I was on the train. A man with a dog on a leash. The man ran and made it, but the dog hesitated outside and the doors closed. No, not on his neck, on the leash, trapping it. The man was inside and the dog was outside on the platform. The button beside the door ringed in light, blinked. The man was shouting now, hitting the button, all else silent. The befuddlement of dog pulled along, the pace slow until it wasn't. The tunnel the train must pass through, leaving the station, is a perfectly calibrated, unforgiving fit. The dog had a color and a size I don't know, so it comes to me as legion, large, small, fur long or short, white or gray, but the man always looks the same. As I held him against me in our kitchen, the moment sharpened my eyes. How easily I could imagine a version of our lives in which he kept all his suffering secret from me. I saw the beer on the counter. I saw myself drink it. When we went to bed, I stared at the back of his head, split between compassion and fury. My nails gently scratching up his arm, up and down, up and down, the blade without which the guillotine is nothing.
Oh, I love that last line so much. That was great.
Thank you. Yeah, endings are my favorite parts of poems.
I can tell. I can tell. There's a lot of thought into the endings. They're all, yeah, I gave this book to one of my friends. They annotated it, and every ending's just circled with like, damn, or yeah, it's just like
Aw,
that's all the notes in it.
thank you for sharing that. That's such a gift to me.
I wanted to ask, this might be a weird question, I don't really know, but
Love a
um
weird question.
about the what are they called? Epigraph? Because
Yeah.
you only have one,
Mhm.
and it's right after the dog, and it is like what separates the collection. And the word obedience, which is a really interesting one. I looked up this poem. I don't know the poet, but
Isn't
the
it so good?
it was really good. And it was like, it referenced, men with knives, and it had like animal, it would like it, there were a lot of things that reminded me of your collection. So I have to say it was a good choice. Yeah, I was wondering both how that word what that word obedience meant for you in this collection, or anything you wanted to say about the influence of that poem in general, because it is the only poem that you included in here, unless I totally missed something.
Yeah, it's the only epigraph, and it comes from Linda Gregg's poem, The Poet Goes About Her Business, just for people listening so they know. And obedience was an obsession of this collection and an obsession of my own throughout my 20s. You know, so many first books are really grappling with um, coming of age and childhood, you know, the terrain of your life up until that point. And I was really trying to wrestle with myself as a very obedient, good girl in the deep South, growing up in a Christian context, being somewhat of an overachiever in school. I really put so much of my identity in being good and meeting certain expectations and goals that, you know, were set by others outside of me. I had a disposition to authority that was very unquestioning in my youth. And gradually, all of these facets of myself that I had to deny or suppress in order to uphold that certain facade of, you know, perfection that I was seeking, they started to just build up in me and feel like they were absolutely going to kill me if I did not find a way to honor them in my life, in my art. And in college, poetry swooped in and became my pressure release valve for so much of that. So many of those doubts, strangenesses, uglinesses, the sides of me that are disturbing and dark and, um, you know, not pretty and pleasing all the time, rushed into poems and were able to have this life and energy there, um, and become something new there, become fun. You know, no longer did they feel like they were, um, you know, just threatening to kill me from the inside out. They felt like material for joy. You know, just because it's a really dark bummer poem doesn't mean I'm not getting, you know, some sort of thrill out of it. So this is all to sort of address the question of why the word obedience is there in that epigraph. I think there's also something so delicious about encountering that line, the body goes into such raptures of obedience. I believe that's what it is. I'm not reading it. You can fact check me if that's wrong. There's something so delicious about encountering that line after the dog, um, which is so brutal. And then this idea of like rapturous obedience sort of immediately is this big swerve because we just seen sort of the dangers of, you could say, a certain kind of obedience, that a dog on a leash could be a symbol for a type of forced obedience. And so then to transition into this book that's gonna complicate this idea a little bit. And, you know, when I think of rapture, I think of, you know, religious traditions, which is going to become, you know, much more of a thread in the book at that pivot point. And it's sort of like it's like we meet the speaker in that first poem. She's an adult, she's married. And then I needed something to transition more into the speaker earlier in life, more into girlhood backstory, if you will. Um, and that epigraph felt like a way to do it. I love Linda Gregg. I love her poems so much. Anyone who is curious, wanting to read more poems, I highly suggest getting a copy of her selected poems, all of it singing. It's very approachable and can like feed and inspire you, even if you're someone who's been studying and reading poems forever. It feels like the type of book that can meet you wherever you are because she has a certain plain spokenness and approach to imagery and relational dynamics and scenes. But also, there's such a mystery to her poems too that keep you coming back again and again. And so she's a poet I keep kind of on my desk all the time as a wellspring of inspiration and reading pleasure.
That the way you describe her sounds a lot like the dog. And yeah, the way you characterize that word obedience is really interesting because like the way you're describing it is very much like some of the standout lines in the collection. The one like all the times I've been kind, knowing kindness is all it would take. Being complimented for like lack of ego and things like that. So there's a couple lines where I was like, yeah, those are really powerful, and yeah, I guess they tie in really well. I want to ask you quickly, just because you mentioned it, about your introduction to poetry in college and what about it captivated you, how you got introduced to it, and how it became the thing. If you really were, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I knew very early on in my life that I wanted to be a writer or do something with books. Books were a refuge for me. I just was obsessed with books from a very early age. I was always reading. I grew up as an only child, and so I guess I had a lot of time to myself where I wanted to escape into other worlds. And so that was not a mystery to me. The mystery to me was exactly what that would look like. And so when I got to college at Auburn University in Alabama, I was an English major, sort of more broadly, and was focusing more and more on creative writing. And I thought I wanted to be a creative nonfiction writer. That was the only way I could sort of see a career path happening. I was like, I'm going to be the new John Krakauer. I'm going to embed myself and do so much research and then write, really gorgeous prose about it. And I thought, that's the way I'll be a writer and actually manage to pay my rent or something. But then to fulfill the requirements of the degree, I had to take some other types of classes. So I took this poetry class, and it was with a professor who had just moved there. She was young, she was pregnant, she was this incredible poet, and her name was Keisha Kuipers. We're still friends to this day. And she assigned contemporary poetry collections. So poetry books like Judas Goat that had been written by someone who was still alive, that was sort of touched by contemporary life in a way I had never seen. I had encountered a few poems here and there, of course, throughout my education in Alabama public schools, but it was like an E. Cummings poem, which I loved at the time. I really did. But there's a big leap between like E. Cummings, Emily Dickinson, and being able to see yourself writing poems today and putting them in a book. It was really not on my radar that poetry was something people today even still wrote and published. I thought like, oh, it's this like cool, really old thing you can dip into and read if you want. But reading those contemporary collections, especially Crush by Richard Siken, just blew open all the doors in my brain. I was so in love with it. It was frenetic and strange and violent and funny and sexy and queer. It was all of these things I had no idea poetry could be, was allowed to be. And it changed my life. It totally changed my life. I loved that class. I loved writing poems. I continued to downplay its potential to lead me into a kind of life for very reasonable reasons. I still didn't know what it would look like to pursue a life in poetry, but I knew I loved this art form and it was going to be a part of my life forever. And when I learned about the existence of MFA programs, and it came time to apply, I was still trying to shoehorn myself into being a nonfiction writer. But I was looking at my writing samples and I was like, okay, I have all these poems, which seem to be like kind of doing something interesting. And then I have these essays that are terrible, that like even I know are trash. And so I was like, if I was a graduate school committee, I would maybe let this person in for poetry, but I would not let her in for nonfiction. And so I applied in poetry with this plan in mind that I would get in and then I would use that supported time, those 2 years, um, at a funded program, and I would just write my nonfiction. Like that was what I thought my plan was, which is hilarious. And of course, that did not happen. I just fell deeper and deeper in love with poems, and I have eventually relented to the fact that that is just my primary mode. I'm a poet. I can still write in other genres, of course, and do, but I have to admit to myself that poetry is, for whatever reason, the genre of literature that matches my brain and my skill set and my desires the best.
That's that like level of like intentional delusion is so funny because it's like, well, why am I writing all these great poems? Just luck. Like I'm still get supposed to be like nonfiction, like seeing the career path, and yeah, that is very funny.
Well, it relates back too to this idea that I was talking about earlier about obedience and this idea of what it meant, to be a good person. And I was so attached to like hard work and difficulty as a marker of worth. Poetry was too fun. I couldn't take it seriously because I enjoyed it too much. And I was at a phase in my life where like pleasure equals bad and unserious, and like really toiling and, suffering is the noble thing. And so, yeah, it was all a part of that journey too.
That's fascinating. Like if literature doesn't feel like manual labor, we're not doing it right. Like the
Yeah.
um kind of down that avenue, something I've been thinking about a lot lately in fiction, and I think this ties into poetry, and your poetry especially, is, and you kind of mentioned this, like literature as like not just a tool for life, not even just like understanding life, but like as life.
Mm,
Because like a lot of, let's say, like, male post-war fiction and things like that that I've read, where it's like life becomes so simple on the page and it's
mm,
like easy to understand and easy to comprehend. Like when we enter their writing, we're in a world that like makes too much sense.
yeah.
And so when I've been looking at some of the fiction I've been reading lately by, newer authors and things like that, and as well as the poetry I'm getting into, I see a lot of connection there between trying to say the unsayable, or yeah, like using words to replace our ability to not understand words. Like I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does
But
to me perfectly. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like I don't know. Yeah, it takes that to another level. So I want to ask about reading modern poetry, writing modern poetry, and how like those patterns reflect your understanding of the world or contribute to it, or yeah.
Mm, yeah, I'm really interested in writing as a life, writing as another life, writing as part of one's other lived experiences. There's a line or a few lines in Judas Goat about the desire to live many lives, which I know is shared by many people, and certainly many artists. And the ability of writing to be one of those other possible lives that gives an outlet for those desires that other ways of living don't allow for. And so it's very important to me for that, as a way to let out the multiplicity of selves, to play out other possibilities, to um, try on other experiences, dream lives and nightmare lives and everything in between. And reading too, of course, does that for me. Reading and writing, this probably comes up in many of your conversations. There's the same process in so many ways, reading and writing. And for me, if my relationship to reading is strong, then I'm usually also writing. And if I have a dry spell in one, it's usually correlating to a dry spell in the other. Something I think about a lot is the sort of mysterious timing with reading. I don't know if you've had this experience of trying to read a book at some point in your life and it's really just it's blocking you out. It's sort of not connecting. You can't find the pulse in it. You're bored, maybe you're just not into it for some reason. You put it away. For whatever reason, maybe someone recommends it to you again a few years later, or you have just the thought to go pick it up again. And all of a sudden it clicks for you. And you're like, what? This is incredible. This is, how could I not have seen before? But something about the timing wasn't right, or the headspace you were in, what you were going through. That book was waiting for you. And I've had the opposite experience too, where I fell head over heels in love with a book. It meant so much to me. It catalyzed a major breakthrough in my own writing. And then I returned to it years later and I can't find the pulse. It seems like an entirely different book. And I'm like, this is what meant so much to me. This is what I've been like, recommending and evangelizing to other people. I was like, this isn't how I remember it at all. And that's so magical to me. Books, writing, literature as a conduit, as a collaborative conduit to dreaming. And it's like we all read a different book when we read a book. And I don't know. I could go on, and maybe this isn't even coherent, but there's something about those meeting grounds of reader and writer and how collaborative that is, and how mysterious that is, and how touched by so many layers of context that is. There's also just the miracle of any book finding its way into other hands and them reading it with no shortage of possibilities and options to read. So even just getting to have this conversation with you and knowing that you've been spending time with the book across the last month, like that feels like a miracle to me. It means so much. And I think about the books that found their way into my hands as miracles too.
That's, yeah, I mean, first, I've had both of those experiences, definitely, especially like as I, entered into creative writing and some of the books I started reading when I was reading more and more. And like those beginning ones where I was like, this is amazing. And then I'll go back and it's like, or maybe with like high school, read The Great Gatsby in high school and you're like, I cannot stand this book. I don't want to see this cover again. And then, you meet somebody who reads it every 2 years and it's like, oh my God, there's all this stuff to find in it. It's like, oh. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. And the way that connects to living different lives and in writing and reading, I've heard people say things like, I can't, read fiction when I'm writing fiction or whatever. And that has never made any sense to me. And yeah, I guess like the many lives thing is interesting because there's a sense of divinity in this book where it's like, I mean, there's conversations with Mary. So you get into like religious divinity, the speaker almost maybe like interacting with Judas in a way. You get like folk tales, the Hansel and Gretel stuff that gets so like I'm wondering how like were you trying to break the limits of time, the limits of one lifetime, like yeah, like you take animal form in certain religious contexts. So yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that aspect because there were a couple of things like and yeah. Anyways, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, those pieces of art and those stories that we encounter really early on in life that are there as we're sort of coming into memory, coming into our own consciousness. I believe that those, I'll just call them texts, are baked into us to an like inextricable degree. And you can be mad about that. You can, wrestle with them, but like they're a part of you and your artistic disposition, whether you want them to be or not. And for me, I grew up spending a lot of time with the Bible, with the Christian Bible, and I was in those stories. I was with those characters, and I, believed that text to have gigantic consequence, spiritual consequence in my life. And that seared them into me even further, I think. So when I was stepping into myself as a writer, those legacies were going to come with me, whether I wanted them to or not. And there were times when I chose to go towards them really purposefully, especially the figures, stories, dynamics that scared me the most growing up, that scared me the most as I was questioning and changing my own relationship to religion, notions of God in general. And so Judas and Mary, and particularly the contrasting stories in the Bible of how Judas died became a point of interest and obsession for me. This idea of, again, multiple stories, the truth maybe being somewhere in between or outside of both options, but the fact that there are multiple, invites in this level of imagination, questioning, wondering. Um, and obviously, he's held as, this great betrayer of Jesus, and in this book that's so interested in various kinds of betrayal, betrayal of a self, betrayal of others. It just made sense that he would appear as a figure in the book, and how his name gets applied, of course, to things like the Judas goat that is trained to lead sheep into a slaughterhouse, and then it gets to leave and continue on its life, and the sheep are killed. But this animal may have no idea that it's being used that way. And so I'm just, and when I was working on this book, at least, I was just so fascinated by those really difficult dynamics of ignorance, complicity, obedience, and violence. So yeah, I strayed a little bit from the corral of your question, but it all feels related to me to yeah, spending lots of time with the Bible as a young person, and fairy tales, those other stories that tend to swim around when one is a child, and the ways that they captivate the imagination. And fairy tales are so dark also. Like there's something about this genre that is targeted for children that is so much like darker and more violent than, at least today, people tend to think that kids can handle. But there's something we're drawn to about that. They're instructional, right? Like they delight and they instruct, usually about themes of safety and obedience. And so these are just some of the reasons that fairy tales and biblical stories surface in the book in various ways.
So you mentioned the Judas Goat, which is the title of the book, obviously, and that poem itself, is it called Judas Goat? The
Yeah.
poem? Yeah, that was you write, I think, but right before the entire collection, like for the image. And there's a lot of powerful images, maybe none more than like the dog on the train, but that one of this goat whose instincts are being taken advantage of to kill, to slaughter who knows how many sheep, and is kind of unaware of it. And that image of him, like he doesn't see it, but he dreams and his mouth is twitching in his sleep. And it's such an insane image. And perhaps, I mean, it's hard to say that it didn't mean as much at, that it wouldn't mean as much at any point in time, but perhaps that idea is more pertinent now than ever. And so you mentioned these kind of fairy tales that are used to instruct. And one thing that stood out to me, because you've been talking about this book for what, like 2 years. I want to try and give you an original question. And I actually have two questions here I'm going to try and tie together, but they're both kind of about football. And
Oh God. Okay.
well, no, but like in the context of the poetry, so it's not going to
Yeah.
be, yeah. Um, so one of my favorite poems was The Lucky Ones,
Mm.
which ending was incredible as they all are.
Mm.
But it really seems to be like uncertainty around societal standards, and you start with that. You kind of mentioned that like easy or like straightforward example of like early marriage. And then you move towards like this guy who I've heard about this briefly being like a college sports fan or whatever, but who poisoned these two big oaks in Auburn. You're from Birmingham, where maybe this guy was from. You're in Auburn, so it's like someone from where you're from coming to like where you are, and like the hatred between those two places, which are not all that different, is insane. And then like calling in and bragging about it on a radio show, and that being like the kind of I'm gonna go on a total tangent here, but Hanif Abdurraqib was just in Madison, and he read this poem about the way Michael Jordan's kind of like kill or be killed, like win at all cost. Like it doesn't matter how big of a jerk you are. If you think I'm a jerk, it's because you haven't won anything. Like these ways that like make us great or interesting or whatever it is in like this sports world are like the complete opposite in real life. Like we really need to evaluate what our society appreciates and calls great and whatever. So I don't know if I'm going to get to the other football part. I forget which which poem it even was, but oh
Strawberries.
yes, oh where like the boys are patriots or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I just want to. I've lost the train of the question, but yeah, like the idea of sports, of kind of like what is appreciated by society and how that like plays into different parts of our lives. If any of that makes sense, it's not even a question, but yeah, there you go.
I love this. And you're right. No one has ever brought in, I don't think, like sports questions. So I really appreciate this. Also, I love Hanif. I love his work so much. Like, what a generous, brilliant mind. I'm so glad you went to that event when he was in Madison. So, yeah. So, being from the Deep South, the two major religions are football and Christianity. And so I knew that southernness was something also I wanted to contend with to a degree in the book. And being a poet who's very rooted in the tangible and the imagistic, football is such a spectacle. And even, there's spectacles around the spectacle of the actual game, right? Which I touch on in that Strawberries poem, the painting of the chests and the war simulation aspect of football in particular, in a book where I'm really taking a look at violences of various kinds and football as this sort of like playful version of that we gather to watch. And I was an athlete myself. I did not play football, but I played volleyball. And so that idea of an athlete's mentality and the differences or symmetries between the sort of like mantras and attitudes we adopt to be successful in a sport versus maybe writing versus relationships with people outside of those forms. In volleyball, I would think a lot about a coach who would make us lie on the floor and just visualize our serves over and over again. And that sort of mental imagery part of the game is something that I feel like I carry forward in my poetics, which is interesting. Um, but football, I was so much outside of it as a spectator, someone who didn't really enjoy football, that, I felt like I was expected to love it, and that made me not want to. And it was kind of repellent to me as an activity, as a sport, just like the rabid effects on the fans too. I would just see it. There were people I knew growing up who, if their team lost that night, like it almost like wasn't safe to go over to that house that night because the dad would be so angry. And it just seemed absurd to me that people would care so much and be rocked so deeply, by the wins or losses of these football teams. But I'm rambling a bit now, but I think these are parts of the reasons that those moments surface in the book. They're a part of the place I come from to such a deep degree. in all of its kind of beauty and absurdity, because there's beauty too, the way it brings people together, tailgating, gathering before a big game, and just spending time eating with each other outside and throwing the ball around. Like that's beautiful to me. It really is. So I don't want to just come off like anti, but I have my critiques.
No, yeah, I mean, I don't think you're rambling at all. I think that that like connection that again that you make with like the boys are patriots and things that if we really think about like what we're being led toward or what's the final goal or why this thing is perceived the way it is or what's a reflection of what and maybe poetry is the best avenue for that. So I have two-ish more questions for you. I don't want to take too much of your time, but one I wanted to ask about kind of about the poem too, but also how it works with the collection. And even after all that, No Epiphany is one of my favorites, and so is Should the First Calf of Winter Be White. They're both longer, and you use form in very intricate ways that it was actually really interesting because I often don't pay attention to that stuff. But I guess when the poem's longer, it feels more important and it does something. Especially like if you like look at just like the monostitches on Should the First Calf, things like that. But and even after all that, No Epiphany, one of the funniest lines in the collection was, let's see if I can find this. A friend said to me once, I'm good at sex. That doesn't mean I should be a prostitute. And I began considering a lot of things, cows, but mostly tax evasion, which is a great line. And I was so confused when I read that the first time. But not only does it obviously make sense when you describe the backstory with, I assume that's a real thing, like MDs buying farms for tax, like so. And then not only that, but it also like you go back to Should the First Calf of Winter Be White? And now that poem makes more sense because you understand like the situation that this girl was in. And it almost makes the collection more of like a story because you're understanding more about the speaker. It's almost like, I mean, I don't know like your story exactly, but it almost feels like autofiction type winding. And that's really interesting. So, um, yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the order of the poems, kind of like winding that story throughout. And yeah, also, side note from Should the First Calf of Winter Be White? What's that line? I'll always be there. It's the simplest line ever, but it like it was so I just it's just beautiful. Yeah. Anyways,
Mm. Yeah, sometimes a short, simple line. I mean, it's all about the pattern and variation, right? Like you can't just have that short, simple line, but in the right context, those are the lines that do tend to sort of really reach out and pierce you. I love them as a reader too, when you're sort of like in a thicker spell of maybe imagery, description, and then all of a sudden someone just says something um, striking or piercing, and it just kind of hits you with more force. I'm also so glad that you're drawn to, and even after all that, No Epiphany. I remember early on, as I was trying to put this book together, I shared a manuscript with a friend, and she suggested cutting that poem because it felt so different from the rest. And, it is risking humor more than most of the other poems. And tonally, it just felt like more of an outlier at that time. I think I managed to ramp up some tonal variety throughout the book since then. And so now it feels more like it belongs. But at the time, I was like, oh no, I can't lose this one. It feels, I can't even fully say why, but it feels important to the book as a whole, in part because it is different and it's offering some humor and sprawling a little longer, um, and is, yeah, giving some counterpoints for what starts to take shape as at least almost like an impressionistic painting of a narrative of the speaker's life and autobiography, with the farm returning. And so, yeah, for me, putting this book together was a exercise in trial and error over and over again across years. It was not an efficient process. It was maddening. I felt like I was getting closer and closer, but I still wasn't there for so long. And I would print out all the poems, I'd spread them out on the floor, I'd say, what happens if it starts here? And then what would come after that poem if it started here? And what would be the most surprising and inevitable place to go next? And I would just do that process and do that process and do that process. And here and there, I would share what I came up with a dear friend. And they would give me some feedback and I would adjust. And there were so many days when I worried it would just never happen. I would never get it to its right order, its right pieces, and the relief I felt when when it finally got there. And when I was working with my editor at Tin House and just doing those final screw tightening moves. Oh, I can't even fully describe the full body relief of that feeling of having done it after wondering for so many years if I'd be able to. Like I sensed it was possible. I knew it was possible. I just didn't know if I had what it took to get it there. And it's been a huge relief to have this book be an object in the world. And I'm not saying it's a perfect book, but I stand by the order. There's nothing that's majorly bugging me about it where I'm like, oh, if I'd only spent, another 2 years trying to wrangle this. It felt like it did finally lock into place. And thank God.
People will underestimate how much of a success that is to not have anything majorly bugging you. Like yeah, that's got
That's
to
one of
be
the few gifts of spending nearly a decade working on the same short book. You maybe have fewer regrets at the
yeah, 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 yeah. So real quick before we get to maybe a final reading, there's so many poems I like want to talk individually about. Dear Birmingham. I think Rosification is the one maybe you'll read that like touch on themes we weren't able to talk about totally. But you obviously have or you had two new poems in the Sewanee Review. I think it was. Congrats on that. Could you say a little bit about what you're no pressure, what you're working on now? Maybe if you're writing poetry, if you're harnessing the creative nonfiction path, reading more than writing, whatever that is. So I know, I imagine you don't want to take 10 years again for the next collection, but maybe you never know. So yeah, anyways.
Yeah, I don't know. Book tour was really exhausting and launching a book took way more out of me than I expected it to. And so honestly, 10 years is feeling like maybe a good idea because I need to rest from that experience. But I've been writing a lot of new poems, and it's really encouraging to me that you mentioned enjoying the longer pieces in Judas Goat because something I didn't want to do, but seems to be happening against my will, is that all the poems are sprawling really long. um, I have a kind of chapbook length poem that came out of a weekly writing ritual that I did with my dear friend Patricia Humanik for a full year. Every Sunday, we would answer the same seven, we called them questions, but some of them were more like statement invitations. And then at the end of that year, I took all of my answers and turned the best pieces into a long poem. So I have that I've been working on, and these other poems that just seem to be going longer and longer. One of the pieces that came out in the Sewanee Review is longish, in that spirit, and I'm just sort of seeing where it goes. I'm not a writer who can have a clear plan or roadmap ahead of time. I have to just see what comes and what feels alive and interesting, and then see how sharp and complete I can make that thing. Um, and then I guess I'll be back to the printing all the pieces out and moving them on the floor again. Although I will say that structurally, it gives me some tentative hope that I might have some bigger pieces to work with because part of what made putting Judas Goat together so difficult is that it was 49 pretty small pieces. But if you have even one really long poem, that gives you something structurally that you can build around. You can think about like that as like a center fulcrum point or as an ending movement. It's just like a bigger block to play with. So who knows? Maybe I'll end up with four long poems and it'll be easy. It'll be like section one, section two, section three, section four.
That would be really cool. The idea of a chapbook length poem is really interesting. I mean, I think that like your biggest strength with those long ones is like the connections you make and the way that like it goes from a completely different feeling by the end, but you hook back on to the beginning with the ending and it goes all over the place, tax evasion and sex workers and you don't know what's and yeah. So
You
I
never know
I I
what's coming.
I really I mean I'm not always a like I don't always want to read long poems, but these ones are yeah, I think yeah, that sounds really cool. I'm very excited to see some of those in the future, hopefully.
Thank
Um
you.
and then yeah, do you maybe want to read Rosification.
Yeah, I can close us out with this one.
Yeah, awesome. Oop.
This is one I rarely read, so I appreciate the invite. And this is the version in the UK edition, so there may be like a tiny discrepancy here and there. I'm not sure between the version you have. Rosification. By its head, it's clearly dead, or almost. The blush the petals once were drifts along the edge. Maybe the rose wants to die, and I'm forcing it to stay with me. I had a teacher once who would say, if he read this, a rose cannot want. Because I cut whatever they told me to, they praised me, teachers, my lack of ego. Now my head is swollen, heavy on its stem. I hold it between my hands while I bend in place. Lately, I only use my phone to search etymologies. The word person comes from false face. My false face is loosening. We are two roses here, is more and more how I think. Meanwhile, my friend across the country is thinking about suicide. Last night, she wanted to reminisce about the boys, the ones who rifled their way or jumped from the parking deck. There were pills sticking to the swamp of her palm when she typed, I'm not going to take them. We lie to each other all the time. What else can we do? I bought this rose months ago. That day, in my pocket, I had a poem on which a teacher had written pathetic fallacy in pink ink. Two young women in love sat close together at a table nearby, hands on the fabric, covering each other's thighs.
I love the way you read them. It's always so slow, and I think that was what hooked me about the dog originally. Um, the pacing of it, the tempo, and you really get each word. It's really beautiful. And
Thank
obviously
you. Yeah,
I
when we read on our own, we often go so quickly
mhm.
that that's one of the pleasures of hearing them out loud is you're really forced to slow to a pace that we don't typically do on our own.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much, Alex. I know it takes courage to dive into poetry when you're not in it a lot. And so I'm so grateful. You're brilliant. I love your questions, the depth of your questions, the range of them, and your readings too are so astute. So I hope you'll have more poets on the show.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Yeah, that's definitely the hope. Anything you want to plug, go get Judas Goat, go to open books if you're in Seattle.
Yes,
And
please.
yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great rest of your day.